All right. Well, hopefully you yourself have read Fee and Stewart on the epistles, the 2 chapters on the epistles, and how to read the Bible for all it's worth. And we have had 2 lectures on exegeting the epistles, one that talked about figuring out what's the point, following Paul's train of thought, or any other author as well. And then we also talked about comparable particulars just at our last lecture. So now what we want to do, is to take a passage and work through it. And what I thought would be most useful would be to actually take a passage that I have preached from and show you sort of the finished product, but also back up several times and talk about why I did something or what I'm doing in a particular place. That means it will take longer than a normal sermon will, and we'll see how long this video turns out to be, but hopefully it won't be too bad. So this one is called lecture number 21, the Exegesis of 1 Corinthians 8 through 10. Now, before I start talking through it, you will not gain much if you don't do your own thinking first. So I suggest again that you turn off the video, read all 3 chapters in one sitting, and jot down some notes about what you think the problem is. So what is Paul writing to? What has caused him to have to write this section? Are there comparable particulars? It's not so clear in this section, so think about what could be a comparable particular here. What is the problem? Oh, I'm sorry, we said that already. What's the point then of each paragraph as Paul works through his argument? It's a long, sustained argument, and therefore, as you work through what's the point of each paragraph, you're also going to be asking, how does he move from this point to this point to this point? So, in other words, his train of thought. So turn it off and do that work and then come back. All right, I hope that that's what you did. And one thing I want to point out from the very start, which you may or may not have figured out from your initial study, the more you do this, the better you get at it. So don't be discouraged if you didn't notice these things this time through, is that they think there's one problem. So when you're asking, what's the problem? They think there's one problem, and that is whether they can eat food offered to idols. And Paul sees 2 distinct problems, and that's how he's going to talk to them about it. He divides the idol food topic into, number 1, are believers allowed to eat in the idol temples? Is that okay? And this is a moral, ethical question, which he will make very clear. And the answer is absolutely not. You cannot do that. The second problem is whether believers can eat idol food that has been sold in the agora, the marketplace. This one, Paul says, is a matter of conscience. And that actually makes it the harder question. How do you decide for yourself whether it's okay to do something or not? So I created a sermon that was part of a lecture series on love and law. Mine was the second sermon of the series back in 2012. And we called my sermon The Law of Love. And what I did then was I started, as you should, every time you preach, you should start with exegesis. You're training your people, your listener, your audience, your church, to gain knowledge of the historical situation and to use scripture right. So you want to be a good example of how that happens. So the first thing I say to my listener is, well, let's remind ourselves that this letter was written for a particular group of people at a particular time in history. So we're going to be focusing. I'll act like I'm preaching sometimes, right? We're going to focus our thoughts on 1 Corinthians 8 through 10 this morning. So if you have your Bible, and you should, you will want to turn there so you can follow along. A little aside there, I think putting the verses up on the screens for people is a big mistake. They're not learning to use their Bibles because they're depending on us to put the words up for them. So open your Bible to 1 Corinthians. Now, who knows this? Was 1 Corinthians the first letter that Paul wrote to Corinth? And I hope I've got somebody out there who says, no, it's the second letter of a series of 4 or 5 letters that were written by the apostle to a church that he founded in the Greek city of Corinth during his second missionary journey. It appears that during the third missionary journey, it probably either in the spring of 55 or 56, that he became aware that there were some issues going on in Corinth that required his attention. He had received a letter from the church, and we know that because in chapter 7, verse 1, it says peride, that those 2 Greek words mean something like now concerning or now about. And he says, now concerning the things you wrote about. So somebody in the church has sent him a letter. We also know from the beginning of 1 Corinthians that he has received a visit from the church as well, a delegation sent by Chloe, who is the leader of a house church in Corinth. And through Chloe's people visiting and the letter that the church has written, possibly from a different group within the church, that this church is divided, theologically confused, and that is resulting in immoral behaviors and damage to their unity, which he's very concerned about. I'd like to work through the whole letter with us and talk about all of these things, but we're going to focus in on chapters 8 through 10, where Paul deals with the topic of food offered to idols. In chapter 8, verse 1, I'm reading from the New American Standard, he says, now concerning things sacrificed to idols. And then he starts to talk about that topic. That tells us, that's peride again, that tells us that Paul is responding in this section to their letter. They wrote something about food offered to idols. So he's answering them. It does not appear from the context that they are asking Paul's advice. Rather, they are arguing for their stance, as it seems to be the case from their letter all the way through. Paul states something from their letter, and then typically he argues against it. Now let's have some cultural background here. The Corinthian Christians were, for the most part, converted out of first century paganism. In other words, they were not Jews, but Greco-Romans, and in their pre-Christian lives, they had been accustomed to going to the idol temples to eat with their friends. About as close as you can get in the first century to a 21st century restaurant. If you want to hang out with your friends, you go to the idol temple and eat there together. And there was also then, because of these idol temples, an abundance of food that was being sold in the marketplaces that had been offered in the temples, but it was left over. So the temples are making a little money off of that by selling it in the marketplace. Now, if you were a Jew, there's no problem here. For the Jews, it was absolutely forbidden to eat such meat that had been offered to an idol because it wasn't kosher. It wasn't properly bled out, and it was unholy because it had been offered to the pagan idols. A Jewish Christian simply would not have a problem here. They would not buy that meat and they would not eat it. But what about the Greco-Romans, the Christians who are now believers, right? For whom this had previously been an integral part of their lives. Paul quotes their slogans throughout this discussion, so we can be pretty sure that what they were arguing for was that they can eat the food offered to idols. We have knowledge, they say. We know that an idol is nothing. We know that there are no gods besides Yahweh. So what harm could it do to stay connected to their friends by eating with them, by going in the idol temple, which is like a restaurant, and eating with their friends? And in fact, it's likely that if they refuse to eat at a function in a temple, they might be ostracized from people around them, maybe people on whom they were dependent for their livelihoods. If the Silversmiths Guild meets in an idol temple once a month to have fellowship and discuss their business, and you refuse to go along, even though you're a silversmith, you're going to lose out significantly in various ways and suffer some repercussions. So this is no trivial issue for them. It's not just, I want to go eat out with my buddies. It's about their livelihoods. All right, well then we ask the question about relevance. And at this stage, we're not done with exegesis yet. But that doesn't mean you split exegesis up from hermeneutics, but that you begin to blend them together and to go back and forth between them. So here we ask the question, has this anything to do with American Christianity? Most of us are not surrounded by pagan idols or tempted to eat food that has been offered to idols. Most of us. But if you have friends who grew up in an Asian culture, for example, ask them about this topic and see what sort of difficult choices they have had to make in their lives. Now, I have a problem here. I live in the Frogtown area of St. Paul, which is an inner city neighborhood that until recently has been about half Hmong, they are immigrants from Southeast Asia who fought on the side of America in the Vietnam War, and half African American. Now there are also a lot of Somalis in our neighborhood, but mostly I'm interested here in my Hmong neighbors. My favorite restaurant is Cheng Heng on University Avenue. I love that place. I go there once every couple months. I'm not much of a restaurant person, but when I go out, I almost always go to Cheng Heng. And the couple who own the restaurant, they know me. They come to the table and talk to me. We talk about their kids. They've got brilliant children. They themselves were highly educated people before they came to the United States. I think he was a lawyer. So they know me well. They can tell before I order that I'm going to eat number 28 with chicken. And at the entry, when you walk into their restaurant, is an idol with food offerings placed in front of it. This is not a foreign topic for me at all. And I have struggled with whether I should go there. And so far, I don't feel the Holy Spirit telling me not to. But you'll see as I go on to preach this sermon that I'm walking on the edge here as far as understanding what would be the right thing. I find that I'm having a witness of Jesus in their lives, and so I continue at this stage. But you could have said that about the Silversmiths Guild too, right? Well, let's move on with that, leaving that hanging in the air. Then we move on to do a little bit more on what's the problem. Now we're back to exegesis, right? And I say to my audience, you might remember that Christian freedom is one of Paul's big topics, that he constantly is saying that you're not saved by the law, and grace and faith is what brings you to God and not works. In the letter to the Galatians, which is the only letter in which Paul gets even more upset than he is when he writes 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians. I can just imagine his amanuensis wincing as Paul dictates some of this stuff to him. He's the one who's writing the letter. The letter to the Galatians is written when Paul learns that legalistic Jewish Christians have come to his Greco-Roman converts from paganism and told them that they have to, in essence, become Jews and keep the entire Jewish law if they want to be followers of the Jewish Messiah. And it does seem to make sense. But this causes great distress for Paul, and he defends in Galatians, he defends their freedom in Messiah Jesus. You don't submit yourself to a new legalism. But in Corinth, it appears that Christians who belong to the early stages of what will be called Gnosticism by the 2nd century are claiming to have a superior gnosis. That's the Greek word for knowledge. And they are arguing for freedom to eat in the idol temples because they are free, because they're saved by grace, because legalism is not right. So as a little bit of evidence, look at chapter 8, verse 10. Paul says, if someone sees you who have knowledge, gnosis, dining in an idol's temple, will not his or her conscience, if he's weak, be strengthened to eat things sacrificed to idols? In other words, if you say, well, I have, this is okay for me. I know that the idols are nothing, and so I'm going to go in the temple and eat. And then somebody else who's not as strong as me sees that happening and is tempted also to go in there and eat, but he sees it as worship. I'm destroying that person, right? So, so there are people who say they're arguing for freedom to eat in the idol temples, and there are others who are so sensitive to the subject, probably because of their own background in idol worship, that they could not eat any meat at all out of fear that it had been offered to an idol before it was sold in the marketplace. Look at the next verses. Through your knowledge, the one who is weak is ruined, the brother for whose sake Messiah died. And so by sinning against the brothers and sisters and wounding their conscience when it is weak, you are sinning against Messiah. Therefore, if food causes my brother to stumble, I will never eat meat again, so that I might not cause my brother to stumble. Some were eating glibly, and others were anguishing. So then we move, even now we're already doing it, to talk about Paul's response. And that, of course, if you remember from Fee and Stewart, is the literary context. We are now beginning to work through Paul's argument. He needs to deal with the sinful results of the extreme freedom of these pre- or proto-Gnostics. But how can he do that and still avoid the theological pitfall of a reactionary switch to legalism, like the Judaizers were doing? So here's a quick overview of how Paul deals with it. So we're looking today very quickly. If we were studying this in a Bible study, we would go through this much more slowly. An overview of Paul's response. In 8, 1 through 13, which is the entire chapter 8, basically, Paul is saying that their argument is based on bad theology. That Christian conduct is not about knowledge. And what is the basis for Christian conduct and behavior? It's love. So love might mean giving up your own rights for the sake of someone else. And so what he's doing here is setting a trajectory. He's not yet giving them an answer to their claim that they can eat the idol food. He's saying, if you love your brother, you would give things up for him for the sake of his faith. So here, they say knowledge, Paul says love. And then he moves on to chapter 9. And what in the world is this? Has this whole quite long talk about his apostleship. We thought he was talking about food offered to idols, and he's going to come back to that in chapter 10. But here he talks about his apostleship. What? Well, why does he do this? Because Paul wants to use his rights as an apostle to illustrate the giving up of rights. He has given up his rights for the sake of the gospel. In chapter 9, verse 19, he says, "Even though I am free from all people, I have made myself a slave to everyone so that I could win the more." And there's, of course, a very important question for him. How is he winning people to God? By submitting, by loving. In verse 23, he says, "I do all things for the sake of the gospel, that I may become a fellow partaker of it." Paul's actions are not based on freedom, but, once more, on love and the hope of reaching more people with the gospel. They say freedom, Paul says love. Then, finally, in chapter 10, he gets down to business. Paul makes it clear that what they saw as one topic, can we eat idol food? And we think we can, is actually two topics. The first topic is a moral absolute. No, they may not eat in the idol temples. He expressly forbids the eating of sacrificial food at the pagan temple in the presence of idol demons. You simply cannot eat in the presence of an idol. So let's look at verses 19 through 21 in chapter 10 just to get his expression of it. Paul says, "What do I mean then?" He's been talking about how they know that idols are nothing, right? "What do I mean then? That a thing sacrificed to idols is anything? Or that an idol is anything? No." So he's agreeing with him there. "But the things which the Gentiles sacrifice, they sacrifice to demons and not to God. And I do not want you to become partakers in the demons. You cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. You cannot partake of the table of the Lord and the table of demons." And here again, our people need a little bit of teaching to understand that in this period of history, in fact, for many years before this, sitting in the presence of a god, which is often in the form of an idol, and eating in the presence of that god is considered worship of that idol. That's why it was so bad when they made the golden calf, that they sat down to eat and drink and got up to make merry. That was considered worship of that golden calf. Here, they're saying, well, we know that the idols are nothing, so we can go in the temple and eat. He's saying, no, you can't. And of course, think about how he relates this in verse 21 to communion. You cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. You cannot partake in the table of the Lord and the table of demons. He's making very clear that when they take communion, that's a worship of Yahweh and Jesus. So that's the easy one. No, it might be hard for them to obey, but it's easy to understand. Then we move to the second half of chapter 10, verses 23 through 11:1. This is not about a moral absolute. This is about matters of conscience. Can they eat that same food when it's being sold in the marketplace? And here he challenges them to understand the tension of Christian freedom versus Christian love. Now, here I have to run through some of the text just to get us in the picture. he starts out in 23 by saying, all things are lawful. That's probably their slogan. And he responds with, but not all things are profitable. And again, their slogan, all things are lawful. Maybe he even taught them that slogan, but not all things edify. So you don't do things for yourself, but for the sake of your neighbor. You can eat anything that is sold in the meat market and not ask questions, right? Because God made the earth and it's good and you can enjoy it and give thanks for it. But if an unbeliever invites you to a meal, go eat what's put in front of you. That's fine. Don't ask questions. Isn't that interesting? Don't ask, don't tell. But if anyone says to you, oh, this was meat that was sacrificed to idols, then don't eat it. Not for your conscience so much as for the sake of the person who's telling you that. Because if I partake with thankfulness, then no one should have anything to say against me. I'm thanking Yahweh for this food. And I will come back to 31 in a second, but that's kind of pulls everything together. All right, so he challenges them to understand the tension between Christian freedom and Christian love. Both things are good, but freedom is trumped by love. So now we come back to hermeneutics. We find that Paul's treatment of a first century ethical matter is actually very easily applicable to our own lives. First of all, there are the non-negotiables. There are things that are always right or always wrong. So things that would be like eating food in the idol temples. Now, Paul makes very clear in his letters what things are always wrong. If we look, for example, at Galatians 5:19, and I have to turn there, so it's going to take me a second, but you can turn there while I am doing it with you. Galatians 5:19. This is an example of a sin list. Now, the deeds of the flesh are evident, he says. Immorality, impurity, sensuality, idolatry, sorcery, enmity, strife, jealousy, outbursts of anger, and he goes on and on there. That's a sin list. And when Paul lists those things, he means that those things are always wrong. Drunkenness, witchcraft, sexual immorality, selfish ambition are always wrong. A little later in Galatians, he's going to talk about things against which there is no law, like faithfulness, self-control, and kindness. Those things are always right. Look at verse 22 and following, the fruit of the Spirit. So there are things that are always right and there are things that are always wrong, and this is not hard to understand. It may be hard to obey, but it's not hard to understand. But then we come to the matters of conscience. This is the more difficult question. There are two faulty ways that Christians have responded, or human beings really, because not just in Christianity, have responded to such issues. One is legalism. And I know that some of you listening to me, I myself had this tendency growing up. I was in an evangelical church and probably didn't have to, but did pick up legalism as my way of coping with my world. And people like that, like me in my teenage years, like to have everything figured out in a list of do's and don'ts. We wish that everything was a non-negotiable because it's easier that way. Christians don't go dancing, they don't take drugs, they don't have sex outside of marriage. Christians do read their Bible every day, go to church every Sunday, tithe their income. If you have a box of rules, then you know what to do and what to think, and life is easier. There's no need to agonize over whether something is okay or not. And I hope you noticed when I listed those things that I mixed moral, ethical things with matters of conscience. Because a person who tends toward legalism puts everything in a box. Then there's the other side of the spectrum, which tends to be the bigger problem in American society today. People who have rightly seen the spiritual poverty that there is in law keeping, but like the Corinthians, they twist Paul's teaching on grace and freedom that he preached in Corinth for sure, but we see the evidence of it in Galatians. That to take that teaching and say, well, that means there are no moral absolutes, right? Why shouldn't Christians smoke marijuana? Why shouldn't Christians read steamy romance novels or play video games 4 hours every day or watch TV as their only form of entertainment in spite of the things that it's portraying to us? Why shouldn't you glance at your neighbor's answer on the exam? Do I really need to give to the poor when I can barely afford to buy my bottled water this week? Do I really need to apologize to my roommate when he's the one that's being a jerk today? You can rationalize all these things away. As long as I'm not hurting anyone else, I'm free, right? I can do as I wish. And I hope that God's grace will cover it all. He forgives me for everything. You can see that's not right. So we need to come to the third L. I don't like to do 3-point sermons, but I ended up with one this time. Legalism, lawlessness, and love. That's the law, right? The law of love. Usually when I know that there's a 3-point sermon coming along, rationalize. Oh no, I can't think of anything. Anyway, some 3 points that have the same ending or the same beginning. I stop listening because it feels artificial. But this time I couldn't avoid it. Our culture has diluted the word love, but it's actually a very complex and hard road to walk on. As Paul draws his arguments to a close in these 3 chapters, this is his focus. Sure, everything is lawful or everything is permissible, but not everything is beneficial. You shouldn't be thinking of your own good, but the good of others. The issue is whether your action is following the way of love. Paul says there will be different decisions on matters of conscience. Christians are free, but their freedom must be balanced with love. Those who are free to do something that is a matter of conscience should not look down on people who are not free to do that. Those whose conscience prevents them from doing something should not judge those who are able to do it. The key statement is 10:31. Paul says, "Then whether you eat or drink or whatever you do, do all to the glory of God." The question you should be asking when you decide on a matter of conscience is whether it gives glory to God. Now, I'm a little anxious about putting this on a recording, but I think I'll be all right. I had a very strong experience with this type of a thing when I moved to Germany as a missionary. I was a missionary to college students with Students for Christ. And when I became a MAPS worker with the Assemblies of God back in the day, I promised that I would not drink alcohol. And later on, when I became licensed and ordained, I continued to promise that I would not drink alcohol. But German Christians drink alcohol. And we would have Students for Christ on Thursday evening, and then we would go to an Italian ice cream place, and some people would have some little pizzas, and some would have ice cream, and often, especially the folks with pizzas, would order a glass of beer to go with their pizza. My Christian students, my leaders in my student ministry, drinking a beer on Thursday night after our worship time. Now, this started for being a problem for me right from the start, back when I was living in Munich in a Christian women's household, and my housemates would drink alcohol, a beer here and there. What's different is that Germans, whether Christians or not, typically do not abuse alcohol, while Americans typically do abuse alcohol. So there's one thing there that helps us understand why one culture has reacted against alcohol and the other has not. But alcohol is not a neutral. It is a drug, right? So there's having to be a decision here. Is this a moral ethical issue, or is it a matter of conscience? Well, I do think that drinking alcohol is a matter of conscience. Being drunk, though, is in the sin lists, right? Paul says being drunk is always a sin. So the moral absolute was drunkenness. And my promise. I promised not to drink alcohol. So if I had decided to break that promise because drinking alcohol, having one beer with a pizza, is a matter of conscience. But if I had decided to have that beer, I would have been breaking my promise, and that's a moral absolute. Now, think about this. I'm sitting, and this happened, I'm sitting in Munich with my housemates, and they're having a beer with their pizza, and I'm refusing to have a beer, and they tease me and say, "Oh, Amy, come on, it won't hurt you. Just try a little bit of it." Now who's sinning, right? They were trying to tempt me to break my vow. And I was sitting there judging them. At that stage in my time in Germany, I still felt that it was a moral absolute and they shouldn't be drinking alcohol. So the matter of conscience was their freedom to drink or not. Where they went wrong was to disdain my weakness and to attempt to convince me to take part. And where I went wrong was judging them for drinking. All right. So here we see that this, even though this is about food offered to idols, and most of us have no problem with that as a temptation in our lives, there's all sorts of things we can say in our Christian lives about this text and use it to apply to the 21st century. All right. Well, if you preached this sermon, how would you want your people to respond? Are you going to have another altar call where everybody goes up by themselves and prays and goes home and no real change happens? I'm not a great fan of altar calls. For specific reasons, they're a good thing, because they call people to a decision. But if you're wanting new theological understanding to happen, or a changed life, that somebody in your church needs freedom from legalism while another person needs to clean up their moral behavior, or if you're wanting to supply them with a new framework for making decisions about matters of conscience, what's the best way to call your congregation now to a decision about this? Maybe they should sit in small groups. Maybe small groups where they divide up between people who find that they are legalistic and people who find that they are lawless. Maybe you wouldn't want to force them into demonstrating which group they think they belong to. But think about a way, with every sermon you preach, think about a way to call your people to the change that you were hoping would happen. And I could talk a long time about my opinion on how we do church and whether the sermon is the best way to call people to change. But I'm going to leave that for another day, and let's end there. And I hope that this will be something that you'll be able to make use of in your life.